I visited my aunt, my 87-year-old aunt, who lives in Colorado Springs, last month, and she has this old Royal Model 10 typewriter that her and my uncle have had since the early 1960s. And she used to write letters with it, and she hasn't been writing letters with this in a while. And when I visited her, I took a look at the typewriter, and it needed a ribbon, which I didn't have on me, and it needed some other work. And so I took it with me down here back home to work on it. And so I'm still working on it. I'm going to keep working on this until I get to a point where it's either fixed or it's going to be good enough, all that I can do, and then I'll have to bring it back to my aunt and make another drive up to Colorado with the typewriter in my trunk of my car, and I'm hoping she'll be pleased with it.
Look what I have here. This is a Royal Model 10 from 1933. Do I have another typewriter in my collection? Well, kind of, yes, but you've actually seen this typewriter a few years ago. This belonged to my late Aunt Pat, who lived in Colorado Springs. She passed away this spring, and just this last week, I was up in Colorado Springs for the memorial service where she was laid to rest next to her husband at the U.S. Air Force Academy. She had had this typewriter since the 1960s, according to her best recollection. I did do a little bit of minor servicing on it a couple years ago, and now I am happy to say it's in my possession, although being a Royal Model 10, it's rather large, and I'm going to have to figure out where to store it or where to keep it. I do have a place right now that I'm keeping it, but I'd like to talk a little bit about this typewriter and maybe a little bit about my aunt and uncle. Stay tuned. My aunt was the last surviving sibling of my dad's generation in our family. She was born in Albuquerque in 1930. Her husband, Joe, was a World War II veteran, and he was wounded in action. He was an Army officer. Later, in the early 1960s, when the U.S. Air Force Academy was being built in Colorado Springs, he was instrumental in the early phases of building the academy, and he was appointed by President Lyndon Johnson to be the first postmaster of the Air Force Academy. My Aunt Pat was a very intelligent, kind woman, but she was also forceful in her opinions, and she had very high standards. One of the things she did was to write a letter to the Lieutenant General who commanded the Air Force Academy and explain her husband, my uncle's, history with the Air Force Academy, and how not only was he the first postmaster of the Academy, but he had a very keen sense of compassion for the cadets and for getting them some innovative services for their mail that would serve them best. And in fact, some of the innovations that my uncle developed for the Air Force Academy's postal system were later adapted by the larger U.S. Postal Service. And so even though my uncle was an Army officer and not an Air Force officer, the forceful nature and intelligent nature of my aunt's letter to the Lieutenant General meant that my uncle and my aunt, were both interred at the Air Force Academy. So Aunt Pat was a forceful woman, and forceful enough that a Lieutenant General of the United States Air Force could not stand up to her argument. And I thought that is a very cool, fitting story to go along with this Royal 10 that belonged to her. Well, the serial number on this typewriter begins with an SX prefix, and according to the serial number database from our friend Ted Monk, it dates to the year 1933, which is 3 years after Aunt Pat was born. This is one of these Royals with the single glass window on either side of the body, which is really cool. The earlier ones had two windows, a larger window and a smaller window behind it. Superficially, the Royal 10 looks a lot like the later version, the Royal KMM that I have. The shape of the finger on the end of the carriage return lever looks very similar to the Royal 10, but the arm itself is shorter. So the left-hand carriage release button is in roughly the same position. It's just a slightly different shape to it. The line spacing selector is very similar. The ratchet release is almost identical, as is the push button clutch release for the line spacing. I think the big difference you see, it really amounts to the margins, where the older Model 10 didn't have the magic margins. Instead, they're back behind this paper table. Folding down the paper table, you can see the left margin device. So simply press it down and slide it back and forth. This little arm right here engages the notches in the margin rack. And looking back here, we can also see this machine does not have keyset tabulator. Instead, it has the separate little individually removable slugs that comes with 5 of them. And I think that you could have gotten more of them from the dealer at the time. So the paper guide is slightly different in shape, but serves the same function. It has a pointer right here for the 0 position on the margin scale. And the margin scale goes up to 23, just like it does on the later KMM. So one area that's quite a bit different on the Royal 10 compared to the later KMM is the scale for the print position. And what happens here is on the Royal 10, the scale is divided into 2 halves, and it's fixed onto the back of the top panel into 2 halves. And so when you're typing on the left-hand half of the paper, the little pointer here at the left side of the carriage points to the scale numbers that are appropriate for typing on the left side of the paper. Then as you get over to the right side of the paper, there is another corresponding pointer on the right half that will give you the scale numbers for the right half of the paper, and those count backwards. In other words, they start from 40 on the right side and go in toward the end, like at 70 or so toward the middle, and we'll look at that in just a few minutes. On the Royal KMM, this scale is one continuous scale, and it's actually mounted onto the carriage itself. One of the more attractive aspects of the Royal 10, of course, is the glass plate windows. The later version like this is a single window on each side. The earlier version was split into 2 separate windows. The windows pop out fairly easy. You have to reach around underneath and bend some spring metal clips that releases the frame here, and it pops out pretty easily. And on this machine, the windows are in pretty good shape. I believe this one, there is a crack in one of the corners, but it's underneath the metal shield or the metal frame, so you don't really see it. The other window on the other side is in pristine condition. Here's one thing you might notice, however, is the feet on this machine are badly squished. And as a consequence, I've ordered a new set of feet from an Etsy seller, and when I get those in, I'll show you guys how they install. But yeah, these are pretty classic for a machine of this age, and especially of this weight, to have squished down feet. So functionally, the ribbon system on the Royal 10 is very similar to the KMM, but it's covered differently. So on the Royal 10, you have this spring-loaded plate that pulls out, gaining access to the ribbon reel, and it's pretty easy to just reach in here and pull off the reel off of the shaft here. And as you might be aware, these are special Royal reels that have a mechanism on the underneath side. So these Royal spools have a spring-loaded arm underneath it, and when you get to the end of the ribbon, this arm, because there's no longer any tension on the pack of ribbon, this arm flips down, and that trips the reversing mechanism underneath here. So you have to wind on the ribbon onto these spools. I think these spools, there are some sellers still selling them, but if you have a machine and you have the original spools with this reversing mechanism, you definitely want to keep them. And you have to thread a modern type ribbon onto the existing spools. And you'll notice in the housing for where the ribbon spool sits, there is a directional arrow that shows you the direction that the ribbon turns in order to take up spool onto the shaft. It will turn that direction to take up the ribbon. And of course it feeds through these 2 fixed guides in the ribbon housing itself. And so like its cousin, the KMM, the ribbon pulls off from the inside of the spool instead of the outside. And so when it advances like onto the left reel here, you can see it's feeding from inside around the vibrator to the inside of the other one instead of the other way, like most other typewriters go. Just something to keep in mind when you are replacing the ribbon or rethreading it onto the vibrator. But pretty much the whole vibrator and card guide holder system on this typewriter is the same as a KMM. And like the later KMM, you have pretty much the same kind of controls here. This knob on the left is the ribbon reverse. It's a manual reverse for the ribbon. And then this is a knob that you manually press to the left and hold in order to manually advance the ribbon spools. Which means you can use the existing spool and this mechanism to wind on a new ribbon onto your spools. So this becomes a built-in ribbon winding system. And on the right side, you have your ribbon color selector that goes between blue, which is the top half of the ribbon, red, which is the bottom half, and then there is a lock preventing you from going to the stencil position unless you push this knob to the left. Then you can go to the stencil position. It's a nice little feature that keeps you from accidentally going to the stencil position and not making a good imprint. Margin release button is on the front panel here, just below that. Left side of the keyboard is pretty standard. The backspace in the upper left, shift lock, pretty much a standard American keyboard here. Moving to the right, we see the tab key up in the upper right, and of course this does not have a key set tabulator, so it's just a single tab key. There is a little bit of a difference in the keyboard down here as compared to my KMM, and of course typewriter manufacturers made a whole plethora of different keyboards. My KMM has an upper and a lower case comma, and the question mark is above the slash. This typewriter has a 3/4 fraction that the KMM doesn't, and they've moved the question mark to a shifted comma above the comma. And as far as the condition of this machine, you'll notice the N has a little chip in it, as well as this period key. And over on the left, the A key also has a little chip in the front of it. And, you know, this is just indicative of the wear and condition and the history of the machine. Some people might want to restore these. I just think it happens to show the history of it, and I'll probably keep them the way they are. Okay, the right side of the Carriage, you have your Carriage knob, of course. You have your Carriage release lever, which is very similar to the KMM's, and you have a paper bale release lever like that, which is very cool, and the feed roller paper release lever like that. The springs on this paper bale are quite heavy, as they are on the KMM as well, and if you're using really thin paper, the paper can sometimes buckle when you're advancing the line instead of flowing freely underneath the rollers because of the heavy spring tension. So sometimes it helps to have a little bit heavier gauge of paper. And this right here is the right-hand side of the paper scale. You can see the little indicator mark. And as you continue to type, the scale numbers count up from right to left, right? The numbers get larger as you go to the left, up to about 70-something, 75 maybe. There are, by the way, some adjustments for this finger. You can loosen this screw, and there's a slot underneath it on the bracket for the pointing finger on both left and right sides, and I've adjusted the guide here so that it points to the same number when you're in the middle at roughly 40 or 39. Both the left and the right pointer should be pointing at the same number, and they do now. I showed you the tabulator bar earlier, but you'll notice there is also a scale on the tabulator bar for the positions of the slugs, making it a little easier to position them appropriately. As far as the condition of this machine, the rubber parts do need to be replaced. Here you can see a crack in one of the paper bale rollers. Here's another even worse one. The platen is not cracked, but it's very hard, rock hard. I have to use a backing sheet of paper when I'm typing with it. Otherwise, the imprint isn't really that good. And that's one of the few things I'm going to have to address in this machine. The feed rollers, interestingly enough, are actually in pretty good shape, though. Well, a good question to ask yourself is a full-size standard manual typewriter for me? That is a great question, because the vast majority of newcomers to typewriters are looking for portables. Usually the smaller the better. And of course, what they don't realize oftentimes is there are intrinsic design and build compromises that come with small typewriters. And with a full-size typewriter like this, you just don't have as many compromises. The machines are built more to work better over the long haul. Even things as simple as the ergonomics, the way the keys feel, they're just intrinsically are better linkage geometries involved in these kinds of full-size typewriters. And the other advantage to a machine like a Royal 10 or its whole lineage going through the KMM and later Royals is service literature is very plentiful. If you find an older book on typewriter maintenance, it's always going to have the basic Royal 10 or a derivative of it like that mechanism. So getting service information on how to do the basic adjustments on these machines is pretty straightforward. And also, a lot of the older typewriter technicians cut their teeth on servicing these Royals. And so again, if any of those are still around, like my friend John Lewis here in Albuquerque, he's been servicing these things his whole career. So there's another advantage there. But being a standard full-size typewriter, the disadvantage, of course, is they're very heavy, they're bulky, they take up room, and you have to pretty much set them in a writing station and just leave it there and use it at that location. They don't have cases, although I did make a case for my KMM, so that's one thing you could think about doing, for at least for storing it. These typewriters are meant to be set down on a desk or other solid writing surface and just used. And if that's the kind of writing methodology you want to employ, I think a full-size typewriter like this, a standard typewriter, is going to suit you better over the long haul than a portable. So this machine types pretty good. The ribbon, I had to reverse vertically, flip it over, and use the other edge. So eventually I'll be needing a new ribbon. The carriage tension on the spring motor is pretty heavy, and I think I increased the tension on it last time in order to alleviate some piling on of letters, which is probably caused by the escapement that needs to be cleaned and degreased a little bit more thoroughly. But other than that, I think I like this typewriter just about as much as the Royal KMM. It has very similar ergonomics on the keyboard, and I can touch type on it quite nicely. When I was going up to Colorado Springs for the funeral ceremony, I kind of knew that I might be bringing this typewriter back. And I had mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, I love my aunt, and I love what this typewriter represents. It's not only a great machine on its own, but it kind of represents her life to me. It's symbolic of that. She wrote a lot of letters to me on this typewriter, and I have those letters. So I knew the typewriter meant a lot to me from a sentimental standpoint, but also I simultaneously know that I don't really have the room for another full-size upright typewriter. There are several ways of approaching this. One thing I could do is sell it or give it away, but doing so, I lose the object as representing the life of my aunt. So there's a good chance I'm going to keep this. The other option, and I haven't actually measured it to find out for sure, I think the Royal 10 is a little bit taller than the KMM, but I'm going to get the storage box that I made for the KMM. I'm going to get that out of storage and see if I can fit this typewriter in that box, if it'll fit. That would at least make a viable solution for safeguarding the typewriter if it's not actually being used. The other option, though, is my office is currently in the process of being remodeled, and this plain background is probably only going to be temporary. We're going to have bookcases behind here eventually. But I have this cabinet off to my left, your right, and I temporarily am kind of keeping the typewriter on top of the cabinet, and it kind of makes for one of those Hemingway-esque standing typing stations with this machine. That's actually not a bad solution. For sure, if you compare the KMM with the Royal 10, I think the Royal 10 just has the looks of a display typewriter more so than the KMM would. Black shiny paint versus textured dull paint, more chrome, and of course the glass windows on the side. So it could function as a display typewriter and also still be functional. So that's one option. And then as far as the work that this typewriter needs to get back up into really good shape, the paper bale rollers do need to be replaced. I can do that myself. The platen is really hard. To get a good imprint, I have to use a backing sheet. The platens are relatively easy to remove on these royals, and so I'll probably be sending this off to J.J. Short. There is the other option, however, of getting some large diameter heat shrink tubing and actually trying the heat shrink tubing trick on this typewriter. But in the meantime, this is Aunt Pat's typewriter, and it actually types fairly decently. I'm curious, though, to hear whether you guys have any relatives of yours who've had typewriters for decades and decades, and if you have access to their typewriter. If so, I'd like to hear a little bit about your story as well. Drop a note down below, would you? I'd love to hear about your family heirloom typewriters. Well, until next time, I'm Joe Van Cleve. Yes, I'm a typewriter fanatic. And I try to stay creative as much as I can with typewriters, and I hope you do too. And until next time, stay well. Bye-bye.